Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our presentation, Communicating to Thrive, especially during COVID-19, presented by Marissa Michaels, Mikhail Chertui, Amber Owens from the Eller College of Management at the University of Arizona. My name is Muriel. I am on the higher education team here at Ivy Exec and will be moderating today's session. Before we begin, I have a few brief housekeeping items for our audience. First, all attendees are currently in listen-only mode. However, we do encourage you to engage in the session by asking questions to our presenter, which you can do using the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel. We will be having a formal Q&A session during the last 15 minutes, but you can feel free to send in the questions anytime during the presentation. Additionally, we are recording today's session, so you can look forward to receiving a copy of the recording via email in the coming days. Now, on to our guest speakers today. As a faculty member on multiple platforms, undergraduate, evening MBA, and online MBA, Mikhail Chertui is passionate about challenging students to exceed their own expectations. He draws from experience in startup business development, international business, cross-cultural communication, and strategic marketing to coach students to success. As a business person, he carries the hard-won lessons of growing a company through the Great Recession, launching a venture out of the McGuire Entrepreneurship Program, creating and funding business plans and managing projects through their life cycles, both in academic and business settings. These experiences have required a positive attitude and steadfast commitment to building lasting relationships with teammates, partners, and key stakeholders. Amber Owens teaches in the undergraduate and graduate program at Eller, focusing on individual strategic business communication. She has graduate degrees in business and education and leverages the intersection of these disciplines to create innovative and compelling learning experiences that inspire transformational change. Prior to her appointment with the University of Arizona, Owens served as an educator, consultant, manager, and leader with top-tier business schools, education management companies, and a nonprofit service agency. Lastly, Marissa Michaels directs the Business Communication Program in the Eller College of Management at the University of Arizona. She teaches communication for managers and coaches MBA advanced field projects. She holds a bachelor's and a doctorate from the University of San Francisco and a master's from San Francisco State University. She specializes in self-presentation, interpersonal communication, and public presentation strategies, and arms students with tools to create desired impressions in their written and oral communication. And with that, I will hand the presentation over to Marissa.
Thank you, Muriel. And while we're on the topic of thanks, I'd like to thank the Eller graduate programs for inviting us to be here today. We have the good fortune of belonging to an organization that really values communication, and so we're embedded in each of these programs. And we have the distinct pleasure of working with so many specialists in all of these areas from all over the world. And so we want to thank Eller graduate programs and, of course, Ivy Exec for hosting. And if you'd like to learn a little bit more about Eller, check us out. That said, we'd like to start today with a poll. Just curious, what most piqued your interest when you signed up for this webinar today? We want to make sure that we are targeting our conversation to the things that most interest you. So please select from the choices on your screen, and that will give us a better feel for why we're all here today.
All right, we're hitting the ground running. Looks like a lot of people are filling out the poll. We'll leave it open for just a few more seconds.
All right, fantastic. All right, it looks like a lot of people are enthusiastic about creating the action plan, which is wonderful. Let's see, 32% determine the impact of social distancing. Fantastic. Okay, so we'll make sure we really give those their due attention. Moving on, the COVID pandemic has created a lot of change. If we're fortunate to continue in our work, we're doing so under different circumstances, namely remotely. And we're doing that in front of a backdrop of a global pandemic, which certainly has its own psychological, emotional implications. And when we're in a state of change or uncertainty, it can prevent us from connecting really meaningfully with other people. So today we're here to discuss with you how you can intentionally plan and execute communication that's going to maintain relationships, connections, and add meaning so we can thrive in the new normal. Here's what we know about the landscape right now. As I said before, it's changing. 62% of people now have remote work experience, and this is double what it was just a few months ago. At the same time, and very interestingly, people seem to be enjoying this shift to a more virtual environment. 59% of people who were polled said they'd like to continue working remotely as much as possible once restrictions are lifted. We know that companies are using this time to experiment with cost projections of what it looks like to be either partially remote or fully remote. It reduces carbon footprint, it opens up the talent pool to people who otherwise wouldn't necessarily have an opportunity to work for certain companies. And there are some cost savings potentially involved for companies as well. So it looks like the workplace is becoming more virtual, and it might stay a little bit more virtual. Now, this comes with its own challenges as well. You may have seen some examples of this in popular culture. We see that partners, pets, children are part of this new normal of merging the private and professional elements in working from home. And at the same time we're getting used to these shifts and changes, we're also dealing with a heavy emotional load in some cases. So from that same study, and that was a Thrive Global, Qualtrics, and SAP study, they had polled 5,000 people from 1,000 different companies, and they found that 80% of people reported feeling more stress, more general stress as a result of the pandemic. Further, 95% of people are more concerned about the health of their loved ones. And we know that this is creating a level of distraction, or at least an extra layer of context that we need to navigate as we communicate. So the unfortunate thing about stress and anxiety is that it starves interpersonal connection. I mean, it does so because it really hits us where it hurts. On the screen now, and you may be familiar with this, is Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So Abraham Maslow argued, he created this model in the 1940s, that our needs are layered. And in order to meet our highest self-actualization or potential, we first need to meet what we call our most basic needs, which are those physiological and safety needs, everything from food, shelter, to safety and work. And once we have those secured, we can move on to more psychological needs like love, belonging, relationships, self-concept, self-esteem. The argument being, once those are satisfied, we can then reach our self-actualization. And we could get into a long philosophical conversation about whether or not that's true. If you're interested, because we've seen people who are in certainly very dire circumstances do things that have inspired generations of people. But here's what's important about this model. When our basic needs are threatened, we're not at the top of our game. And people perform less optimally. If you need an example of this, take a look at the toilet paper situation in the country right now. When we are under high levels of stress or we're fundamentally threatened, we lose that other and self-awareness that we need to connect. And this is because we really, it hits on some of our most basic survival mechanisms. One being the fight or flight mechanism. You may have heard of the amygdala hijack. It's when we are feeling stressed and in a situation where we're threatened, the logical or rational part of our brain sort of turns off, and then the more emotional part of our brain takes over. and we see behaviors that we wouldn't otherwise necessarily see, and for the most part are not the type of behaviors that are going to help us in a situation like our professional environment or relationship building. It could save you if you're running out from under a falling microwave or something like that, but otherwise they're not the best for our relationships. And so how can we address this in a meaningful way? I think one of the most important things you can do is create some psychological safety for the people around you. And psychological safety is defined as that inclusion in a safe space for growth, learning, contribution. Most importantly, it's a feeling of belonging to a group and being able to do all these things in that group, but also being able to make mistakes, being able to fail, and feeling that we'll still have a part of that group or value to that group. And we know psychological safety is related to a lot of related feelings and emotions like trust, confidence, certainty, and security. And when we have that in an organization or in a group, and whether that be professional or personal, we know that people in that group are more creative, they're more productive, and they're certainly more collaborative in their problem solving. And these are the types of behaviors and actions that we most need right now, because these tend to be the actions that help us survive, thrive, and move on from difficult situations. If we create a sense of psychological safety for one another, and it doesn't need to be a large, well planned out initiative. You can do this on an individual basis, and you can do it by attending to people's most basic interpersonal needs. So Schutz said in the 70s that we have, generally speaking, 3 interpersonal needs, and you may be familiar with this construct. It is the theoretical baseline of the FIRO-B personality inventory, and it allows people to get a better feel for what they need and what they have to give, as well as what others need and have to give. So those 3 needs are affection, which is appreciation, warmth, recognition, regard, inclusion, belonging, interdependence, membership, and finally, and certainly last but not least, control. That I have feeling that we have agency, that we can direct or command a situation if need be. And these controls these interpersonal needs are twofold. So we have what we call both desired and expressed elements of these needs. And you can really think of that as inputs and outputs. So in terms of affection, there's a desired amount of affection I want to receive, but at the same time, and depending on the person, I may have a very different or a very similar need to express affection to someone else. And that's true for each of these interpersonal needs. We have a certain level that we want coming in, and we have a certain level that we like going out. We know that these needs are dynamic, and they change based on all sorts of things. The context, so professional, personal, the situation, whether it's a high stress or more relaxed situation, the relationship we have with the individual, and our emotional state at that particular moment. And I can give you a quick example of how this works for me in my professional life and personal life. And then I'll ask Amber and Mikkel to hop in and give me an example of how inclusion and control play out for them, because if I go through all 3, I'll feel like you'll know way more than you'll want to know about me, and then I'll probably owe you $175 at the end of this hour. So in terms of affection, in my personal life, I'm what you call a pig for love, especially when it comes to my niece and nephew, Natalie and Jonah. They're my favorite people, and I get so much out of the input that I get from them. If they tell me I'm their favorite aunt, which I love, I'm also their only aunt, but still, when they send me cards or tell me they love me, that fills my cup. At the same time, I love lavishing attention on them, even though they're 12 and 16. I also have to realize that their needs to get affection and give affection are slightly lower. So I have to realize that, you know, I might need to call 10 times before they pick up once, and that's not a problem because there's no offending me. In my professional life, it's a little different. So I have a slightly lower need to receive affection because I fancy myself as someone who's pretty good at identifying other people's talents and really leveraging and celebrating those. So I don't feel as comfortable being in the spotlight, but I do like shining it. And that's something I need to consider, because if I'm not taking in a compliment, or if I just shrug it off, I could be denying one of my teammates, you know, their need to show affection. Mikel, you want to talk a little bit about inclusion?
Sure. So I'm a little bit different professionally versus personally, but when it comes to professional inclusion, one of the things that I will never ask for but always appreciate is being invited to do things. So I like to be in on the joke. I like to know, you know, at the beginning of a meeting when there's small talk happening, I like to know what people are talking about, to feel like that I'm part of the sort of zeitgeist of the moment. So, but I will never ask for that. Sometimes I wish to be included, but I don't do a very good job of inviting myself along or asking for that, which we'll get into more of this later, but it's a difficult balance to find. Professionally, personally, it's very difficult right now not to be included in my family, because we all live at, you know, in our worlds right now. So mostly when I come home, you know, or when I log off the computer, I just want to sit with my family, turn my devices off, and that's enough for me. But in the office, I do love to be included.
Great. Amber, control.
Yeah, control. So that also, it manifests a little differently for me professionally and personally. I would say my innate need is a higher in this area. Professionally, that means that I've been drawn to a career that allows me a lot of autonomy, a lot of agency. I have a solid foundation of support from my employer and from the team that I work with. But as an instructor at a business school, when I go in the classroom, certainly there's a sense of control that you get to walk in the door with. Personally, that manifests a little bit differently in my home. There is a tendency perhaps to want to command, but as the children have grown up and are now teenagers, I also recognize that we have the best interpersonal relationship when I also recognize their need for autonomy at this stage in their lives. And everything, when that balance is struck for both of us, it just makes the relationship really blossom.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. So as we continue to discuss how we can make a really solid plan, communication plan for communicating with other people, the best place to start is in your own head and in the moment. Self-awareness is such a key element of how we interact with others, and it's something we should take into consideration as we plan to reach out to other people. So ask yourself, what do you need that day or in the moment? How do you express your needs? What do other people need? And what can you give? And the purpose of this is to really think about what your communication partner might be needing. And most importantly, to make sure that your needs aren't overriding theirs. So we ask that you really engage mindfully. And we do that because we know that just like a yawn, if I yawn, you might be tempted to yawn as well. Stress is also contagious. Stress contagion is a model that's been proven scientifically, physiologically. If we are around someone who's exuding a lot of stress, it tends to integrate into our own day, our own minds, our own behaviors. So we want to think about how we're engaging in our relationships and who we're discussing what with, so that we can take care of ourselves, but also be mindful of what other people need. And Amber will talk a little bit more about this in her section, but I think, again, it really boils down to mindfulness and presence. So Amber, tell us a little bit about that.
Thanks, Marissa. Yeah, when I think about presence, when I think about our ability to meet these needs for affection, inclusion, control, and communicate with one another, we really can't do that unless we connect. I mean, really connect with someone. Because if you're not present, you can't have any of those other things. And we certainly want other people to be present with us when we're interacting with them. But we get into some of these real specifics about what does that mean and what does that look like? When we think about being present at work, well, it used to be a lot easier. We'd get up, we'd get dressed, we'd get in the car, and that was half the battle right there. But for those of us that strategically manage our presence, we then also intentionally, mindfully make some choices about how we position ourselves in projects, through our affiliations, through our communications. Some people create that presence through primarily social means. You know the ones, they're creating the happy hours and the lunches together, coffee breaks, while others of us use primarily task-oriented strategies. We select high-profile work and promote that work within the organization. And whether you've done primarily socially oriented strategies or task-oriented strategies, it's likely that you've had some mindfulness in establishing your presence. When we look in a focused way at the last couple of months, I challenge you to think about, what does it mean to be present today? What does it look like to be present in a distance environment, in a virtual environment? And how do we strategically manage that presence in this environment? I'm curious if you've developed some translation strategies that have helped you to move what's worked successfully for you in the past into this environment. And I'll invite you now to share with us, how do you show up? How do you share presence today? If you'll use the question box, go ahead and type in a couple of things for us and share with us what some of that looks like for you. And while those are coming in, let me invite Marissa and Mikhail, if you would, share with us, what are you doing to show up and to be present in your distance relationships today?
I try to keep my camera on as often as possible, but when I'm at home, that doesn't always work well. So I do find myself writing in the chat, I'm sorry I don't have my camera on, I'm saving bandwidth. But as much as I can, I try to mimic what we'd see in a face-to-face environment by being visible physically.
Thank you. Mikhail, how about you?
You know, one of the things that sort of defines me as a person in the workplace is that I'm very in the moment, very present. I try to be very, very present, but that works against me in a virtual environment. So one of the things that I've been struggling with is that my sense of time can be a little bit different. So I've been trying to, as I've been very present and focused on whatever task is in front of me in the moment, not to let too much lag time pass between emails. So I try to improve my response time, be a little bit more responsive on text, Slack and email, those kinds of things, to demonstrate my presence to my colleagues. And it looks like we're getting some interesting you know, information in the question box. If you'd like me to share some of that, Amber.
Yes, please do.
So little things, and this is the thing that I love seeing how different people accomplish this. So coffee breaks on Zoom, which is something we can all relate to for sure. Things like using a camera, to Marissa's point from Michelle, liking or hearting statements on collaboration platforms, adding emoticons. Really great idea there from Rebecca. Weekly calls, weekly video calls, just trying to improve that communication stream. Being interactive during meetings, not just sitting there like a toad on a log, you know, but being interactive and trying to participate. And we're seeing a lot of those kinds of things here, trying to, there's an interesting one here, not mute your life. So from Lori, you know, not, oh, excuse me, from Myra, not muting the microphone when kids are running around, because you want that background noise, and just to communicate to your friends and colleagues that you have a life as well, and incorporating them in that. So really, really interesting little tactics that people are using to demonstrate their presence. Thank you all for sharing that.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing. And I think you'll hear threads of a lot of those things in some of the stories that we'll be sharing with you today. One of them, though, comes from a little bit different perspective. This is my friend Tiara, and she is a professional product manager. She worked 100% online, remotely, before the current crisis. So she had sought this job. She sought a job working remotely many years ago. She has a high level of structure. She's highly organized. She's very task oriented. So this has been her preference, and she's really, really good at it. She has had time to try different strategies, to see what works, to get feedback in the moment, and to devise a way to have a virtual presence with colleagues who otherwise work at one location. What's really interesting, why I wanted to talk to her, was because I was curious if her life had changed at all since the rest of us joined her in this virtual environment. And she said it absolutely had, that it changed overnight and that it changed a lot. She said all of a sudden there was kind of this nervous, frenetic, frantic activity that she was getting twice as many emails, twice as many requests, and no longer phone calls, no longer people calling just to chat, but making a request for Zoom meetings. And most notably, she said, you know, what I would want people to know is that it's okay to be present without being over present. And as we talked, I kept thinking, you know, what is going on here with all of these emails? I think a lot of us have experienced that huge inundation and influx of increased quantity of communication. But in some ways, our interpersonal needs still may not be getting met, even with more communication. So I want us to think about that balance, because it's possible that we may be over showing up with regard to quantity, but we need to at least ask ourselves, are we showing up with a quality of presence? So let's take a little bit of a look at what presence means. This is a model that I'd like to share with you. Christy Hedges, she's a distinguished executive coach. She's a political consultant, a speaker, and she's an author. If you're interested in this, actually, you might pick up her book, The Power of Presence, and she goes into a lot more detail than we certainly will here today. But it at least provides a foundation for understanding presence in some broad terms. As you heard from Marissa earlier, mindfulness about your presence is really key, and that manifests in this model in a few ways. You may consider starting to take some notes to begin guiding your own personal calm plan as I go through this. So first, Hedges says that you need to set a positive intention for the type of presence that you want to convey. This is your personal or professional persona. What do we want others to see us as? Who do we want them to associate us with? With that, we also want to create situational intentions. As you go into a specific meeting or conversation, what do you want people to say after you've left that Zoom room, after they've read your email? Secondly, she talks about communication needing to be individual and presence needing to be individual. This is about a relationship between two people. It's between me and you. Sending out a lot of bulk emails does not establish an individual presence at all. But certainly at times, a personal phone call where you're building trust, where you're talking one-on-one with someone, you're looking at issues like credibility, reliability, intimacy, and a low self-orientation. These help build that type of trust and show an emotional intelligence that's essential when we're working virtually. The third area that she talks about is inspirational. And this really comes to the heart of it. How do you make other people feel? Do they want to go with you on your persuasive argument, on your project that you're pitching? Do they want to associate interpersonally with you going forward? And by building those types of relationships, you'll have greater success. It's likely that you can think of someone comes to mind who has successfully brought presence to their professional life. They have a lot of success, but they also make you feel like you're really connected with them when you're interacting. For me, I think of my friend Roberto. So Roberto is a business development executive, and he was recently recruited to a new startup company. He started in January with a split time schedule. It was about 75% of his time in New York City, and the rest would be virtual, likely traveling to different clients and partners that the company had. Of course, New York City went on lockdown right away after he got started. And he's such a high-touch individual. He is a people person, a natural team player, and a consensus builder. So I was curious about how this virtual shift right after starting at a new place would feel for someone who thrives on that interaction and on building relationships. So I gave him a call and I said, what's this like for you? And he said that he's loving it, that their relationships are growing strong. He feels that he's developed great relationships with his bosses, with his new peers and colleagues, with the different teams that he's supervising, as well as partners and clients. He talked about using different communication channels to help create a virtual environment that met their needs. For instance, he said that they use Slack for quick checks, and that for him, that's like walking down the hall, right? And then when you want to go in someone's office on Slack, you say, hey, can we hook up on Zoom real quick? And that they would have these rapid fire kind of Zoom meetings, and that there was still a lot of this relationship building. What was interesting, though, is that he said he's so tired at the end of the day. And this is someone who has 1 million miles on United, who works out every day, who runs marathons, and he's telling me that now he's more tired than ever. And so we're thinking about, why is that? And after being on having all this communication throughout the day, but he's just kind of emotionally and mentally wiped out. So I have a theory, and a lot of us have seen some articles about this likely, but I'd like to ask our group who's here with us today, if we can bring up the poll on how you feel about web conferencing visuals. And Marissa, as you're answering that poll, Marissa shared with us earlier some of her feelings about using the camera. And I have to say, for me in big meetings, I generally have opted to use it too, because I want people to see that I'm present. But then there are some days where I'm like, I can't be seen today. I don't have it in me, right? And sometimes we opt for the phone call or for email. So as we're looking at these different channels, give us your thoughts in general. How important are these visuals to you? And Mikkel's looking at those results and going to share with us shortly.
Mm-hmm. We have about half of our attendees so far have voted. I'll just, if you don't mind, we'll run it for a couple more seconds and then look at the results. And there we go.
Great. Okay, so we're seeing that more than half of the people said that they're watching for others to see their reactions, and that they want others to see that they're highly engaged. I find it interesting, we didn't have any responses about bandwidth, and that's a great thing. I know that that is a real concern, though, for some of the people that we might be interacting with. So we always want to be mindful of that. But it looks like this is something that we're looking at as a real value add, and I think that's true. But there are a few things that I want to talk about just a little bit for when we are opting for the webcam, that we don't necessarily just default to it, okay? Why that might be. So social scientists, as Marissa shared earlier, in particular with like Schutz, looking at what are our interpersonal needs, and they've been looking at who we trust and why we trust them. And there's really fascinating research in that area. But there's also some research that comes from a really unexpected place in recent years. And this is from computational scientists. So while social scientists say, here's what people feel when they're connected, the computational scientists are able to look at it and say, what is making people feel that way? What are the micro cues that help develop the feeling of being related or connected to one another in an interpersonal way? Dr. Sandy Pentland, who is from MIT, created, he really pioneered this new field called sociometrics. And his main question is, how can computers help us better understand the social language of human beings? He identified 4 areas that he calls honest signals. And he went on and was able to draw connections between these areas and things like how likely someone is to share their phone number at a speed dating event, or how successful they are in salary negotiations, the predictability of 2 researchers choosing to collaborate after meeting at a conference. So I'll take just a quick moment to talk about these micro cues and the 4 categories of them, and what that then we might look at how that manifests in a purely virtual environment. So the first is influence. And this is essentially how our attention manifests. It's the conversational, verbal pushing or turn taking that we have. We've all had the opportunity to engage in a conversation where there's a rapid fire back and forth. I share, you share. and it shows how closely we're getting connected on this particular topic. The second area is mimicry, and this is our reflexive copying of one another. It's a really fascinating area. We could talk about it all day long, getting into mirror neurons and all these things. Suffice it to say for today, it's essentially when I smile, you smile back. If you nod, I nod. Those are subtle micro cues that we have that show that we are interpersonally connecting, and it's empathy at work. The third area is activity. And it's likely if you've been around kids or even dogs, you see how much they jump around when they get excited. Now, we as professionals have learned not to jump around a whole lot when we get excited, but we do still show increased activity. We show increased activity in our head movements and in our gestures and in how much our expressions change as we talk. The fourth area is consistency. And this is what we're listening for in terms of like verbal modulation and fluency. The greater it is for someone, the more expertise we believe they have, and therefore the more credibility and connection we'll feel towards them. So these micro cues are present in all of our interactions, but we don't normally spend much time interpreting these signals because we do it subconsciously. As social animals, we have learned from the time that we were infants how to read these cues, unless there's a disconnect. So what happens in the virtual environment? Well, for this, we look at what happens with micro cues once we move from the live, face-to-face, co-located types of interactions into anything in the virtual environment. First, let's tackle macro expressions, just real quick, because I think it's important. When we think of a macro expression, that's just my face. It's my general expression that you might read. Take the smile, for instance. In most Western societies, this is a really comforting expression. We use it to signal to others that we're approachable, friendly, happy, that we're safe. Remember Christy Hedges from The Power of Presence a little bit ago? She did an experiment where she videotaped her executives that she was coaching. And when she showed that back to them, a full 99% said that they need to smile more. We can learn a lot from that in all our interactions, but especially online, because it's easy to forget to smile when we're talking to our camera, right? So think about your macro expressions, but then let's also consider the micro expressions. These are the cues that are so small. They're largely unintentional, they're largely uncontrollable, and they typically occur within 1/15th to 1/25th of a second. They are small, but they're very important because, again, we're hardwired to watch for them. And they convey some pretty basic emotions like disgust, anger, fear, sadness, happiness, surprise, and contempt. As social creatures, we trust them more than anything that we hear because we know that they're honest. And we feel uneasy when there's a dissonance between what we're reading and what we're hearing. We may not always be able to say, oh, I saw his eyebrows go up, or I saw her jaw tighten, but we did read it and we know what it means. So in a virtual environment, it gets a little tricky. We're all still making these micro cues. We're all still giving micro cues to one another, but we may not be perceiving them as much in a virtual environment. If you're texting or emailing, you just have the words to go on. That's fine. That's what we expect from that email. And if you're on a phone call, you don't have any visuals, but you have an increased focus on that voice, on the tonality, on the vocalics that you're hearing, on influence elements like pauses, as we learned about from Pentland's work. We're drawn to the video conference so much because our brain tells us that we'll have a richer connection with other people. If you're on a video call, you have so much more to read about someone visually, right? Well, maybe you have those visuals to read if the person has their camera on, has good lighting, is looking at their camera, your resolution is good, you're looking at your screen at the right moment, you're looking at their face, the audio is good, there are no buffering issues, no transmission delays, no bandwidth issues. So your brain is telling you that you're having this richer interpersonal connection, but somehow your heart may be left behind on an interpersonal level. In the end, we need to accept that these micro expressions may be absent or go unnoticed in a virtual environment. And that's the point in talking about it, because if they're absent, we're left without a really rich data stream that we're accustomed to. And that can create dissonance, for us that we have to reconcile emotionally and mentally. Our heads know what was said, but a deep part of us is still susceptible to uncertainty. And in this void, we're also susceptible to a potential for perceiving negativity. You might find yourself wondering more, what was really meant by that? And we just spend more mental and emotional energy trying to reconcile our communications. So there are a couple takeaways for us here. One is that this awareness alone is enough to help us amplify some of our honest signals in a virtual environment. And two, we can recognize that this processing does take extra energy for us, and when there are mitigating factors. And so we can give ourselves a little bit of a break to understand that that's what's happening. And as we're making our channel choices, to look at what are the pros, what are the mitigating factors, and to take all those things into account as we're making choices about how our different needs are being met through our professional relationships in a virtual environment. I want to tell you one last quick story, please. This is my friend Juliet. She is an upper level professional. She is responsible for managing multi-million-dollar projects at a highly esteemed large financial institution. It's a traditional place. It's a very professional place, and it's a somewhat conservative place. She was present on site for over 40 hours a week previously, as most of all of the employees were. A significant physical presence was a part of the culture. And while she's recognized some challenges and some inefficiencies with the move to a virtual environment, she also thinks a lot of good will come from it, specifically as it relates to how people's interpersonal needs are met. She sees people expressing greater empathy for one another. She enjoys the casual invitation to opt into a lunch breakout. And she appreciates the newfound agency and autonomy in her work. All of these speak to Juliet's needs for affection, inclusion, and control that Marissa shared with us earlier. So it's clear that there are wonderful takeaways for all of us from this challenging time that we'll want to keep going forward. I'd like to hear from my colleagues here real quick, and also invite everyone who's on our call to type in a little bit for us and share with us, what have you experienced during this time to take forward in terms of how your interpersonal needs are met and how you're meeting the interpersonal needs of others? What is worth keeping for you? Go ahead and type that in to the question box, and I'll ask Marissa, will you share real quickly with us something that you found that's worth taking forward?
I think there's more awareness of the relationships that we need or that we miss when we're not necessarily in face-to-face environments, and it's caused me to become more connected to relationships that, especially in my personal life, that were less engaged. So things like having a happy hour with friends every week. Now I speak to some people more than I have before. So that element's been very nice for me.
Mikhail?
I'd like to take this opportunity, if I can, just to look at some of the information or some of the responses that are coming in right now, because they're a lot more interesting than what I was going to say. We're seeing
I believe that
of different things that the companies are still in overcorrection mode, and they're over zooming, they're over meeting. So that quantity over quality, people are being far more open about their personal lives than they were before, and that could be good or bad, but it sounds like from this particular person, it's probably a good thing. Checking in more often and not just talking about work, but just taking the time to check in, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes. And then, how much sort of advanced planning and thought it takes before you interact with somebody, because they tend to be organized, scheduled interactions, and so you're trying to prepare yourself and think about that interaction before you have it. And I'd love to come back to some more of these. I'm also seeing some stronger interpersonal relationships coming in, so it looks like some people are finding that balance and that ability to thrive in this environment already.
Great.
But it seems like it's coming down to trusting each other, number one, and then also looking to connect on a more personal level, even in a professional setting.
I love this too. I want to shout out Laurel, increased efforts at authenticity, because none of this works. You can't have strong interpersonal relationships if you're not being honest about who you are and wanting to know honestly who other people are. These are wonderful. Thank you all for sharing. Mikhail, will you take us forward into how do we put this into a plan, into action going forward?
Sure. So, and I'll do the best I can to leave time at the end for questions. So far, what we've heard from Marissa at a very high level is kind of an explanation of why we might feel the way we do right now. And then Amber took us through from various different lenses what we can start to think about in terms of the micro cues we're sending, the messaging strategies, and those kinds of things, and how we can think about somebody's interpersonal needs and our own interpersonal needs as we craft a sort of a plan forward. So let's take a look at now and see what we can do. And it sounds like a lot of people are already doing some of these things to chart a path forward for ourselves. So as we know, and this is something that Marissa discussed earlier, I think her toilet paper slide was just about the most crystal clear image that we could have gotten of this, but crises trigger physical reactions in us that distort the way we perceive information and situations, that are the way we make decisions, and then of course the outcomes of those decisions. So we're not on our best game in a crisis, and to greater or lesser extent, depending on your work situation right now, depending on whether you're in between jobs or looking to make a change, or you're still employed, or wherever you're coming from, depending on your level of leadership within your organization. I know in this room today, we have a lot of people who are at higher level positions of leadership or management in their organization. So you're kind of trying to meet different levels of people in different places. So, and we may feel more or less in crisis, but I think it's just important to recognize that, hey, we should be listening to those little flags, or looking at those little flags that might come up that tell us that we should be more mindful about the situation that we're in. The key our fundamental assertion today is that there are some things that you can do to retake control. And this goes back to what Marissa discussed earlier. There are ways that you can be more agentic and exercise your agency and retake control to create the conditions that you need to thrive in. So not just survive at the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy, but getting up into that thriving position where you can start to feel like you are working at your highest level. So first, think about what it takes for you to thrive, and different people may have different reactions to this. Is it doing meaningful work as you define it? Is it accomplishing something as part of a team? Is it contributing to other people's success? Is it being recognized or appreciated? And certainly I'm one of those people who loves to be appreciated. Or is it having control over your own work, or being able to set your own hours and your own balance of things? What does it take for you to thrive? So in order to, what we may or may not realize when we're in a position where we are in kind of a crisis is that we have more control than we think we do. But you kind of have to eke out that control. You kind of have to get in there when the door is cracked open and create an environment where you can get the kind of feedback that you need to have your interpersonal needs met, as Marissa discussed earlier. And it all comes back to intention, as Amber discussed. How intentional are you when you initiate a communication? And I think this was included in some of the comments that were posted in the question box. Can you intentionally include others? There are people on teams right now who feel left out, right? So what can we do to intentionally include others? How can we be more mindful during meetings and just general interactions, right? How can we be more intentional in our affirmations? Again, without overdoing it, but little things that we saw earlier, like hearting, liking, emoticons, those kinds of things, right? And then how might we be able to flex to other people's work styles? And before we move to the next slide, the key thing here is that a lot of the feedback we get on how well we are doing these things, how well, whether it's how well we are being proactive in these areas, or how we are doing in terms of having our needs met, comes informally, comes serendipitously, happens on the margins of conversations, before the meeting ends, at the end of the meeting, maybe in the chat window of Zoom. These are not formal documents that we get stamped that we're doing a good job, or that we're being inclusive, or sort of living our, being our best selves. So how can we create the conditions where we have enough breathing room for those kinds of interactions to happen? And that is the core of your Thrive map. So there are some things that we know from the research that challenge us to become the bridge to other people in situations like this. The problem that we have right now is that the research is not where the reality is. We currently live in a reality the research has not really prepared us for yet, because most of what we know about leadership and about teamwork, about interpersonal communication is based on close, sustained, personalized contact. But we don't have that right now, as much as we used to, at least. New organizational realities are challenging this assumption. So there's an opportunity, and this, when I came across this several years ago, this surprised me, so I thought we'd share it today. There are some things that you can do to become that inspirational type of leader that, or team member even, that Amber was discussing earlier, to gain commitment and build trust on your team. So number one, in terms of, there are some things you can do to create a shared social context, that we are a team that succeeds, that we are a team that gets along, that we are a team that have each other's backs, right? So focusing on the team's mission and the shared values of that work team. And many of us in this room today are most likely on many different work teams. So you kind of have to, it might be hit or miss depending on the team. But this is what surprised me. As a person who is generally more socially oriented in terms of how I build relationships and trust versus task oriented, this surprised me. Because people like me oftentimes misfire. We over communicate, we put too many exclamation points in our emails or texts, too many emoticons, those kinds of things, where really we should be focusing on cognitive forms of trust, that getting things done on time or even a little bit early build trust, and then allow people who are maybe more on the driver end of things, and more of the getting things done, the task-based trust end of things, allow those people to check things off their list and then relax enough to create sort of a nicer interpersonal dynamic. So on your work teams, it may be that you need to focus on the emotion less and the task completion more in order to build that narrative on your team that you are a team that gets things done, right? That you are a team that succeeds. And then once you succeed at something, whether it's a successful webinar or whatever it is, be enthusiastic when you meet your goals. And hey, we just did this. Great job, everybody. Give people their shout outs, give people their kudos. And then that does a lot to establish your track record on your team. So let's take a look at what people are telling us from the trenches, as it were. The first couple of quotes on here discuss, share experiences from people that we interviewed in preparation for today, that, taking a breather and discussing how we're handling our workloads has been really effective, that demonstrating understanding and compassion has been really effective. And those two things are examples of affection on a team. The next quote here talks about the fact that we are all in this thing together to better understand ourselves as individuals, to establish ourselves as people that have a growth mindset, a learning mindset, that, hey, we are doing the best we can right now in this situation. We're going to keep on learning and keep on getting better, forgiving yourselves for little mistakes that you might make or errors you might make. And that's an example of inclusion, that we're all in this boat together. And then finally, the last couple of quotes talk about how teams have been able to develop more discipline by communicating more. Now, remember what Amber mentioned earlier about quantity versus quality. Quality definitely wins, but communicating more, demonstrating your determination to be successful, and then being flexible to other people's work styles. One of the things that I've had to learn from working with both Marissa and Amber in an online environment is that we have very different needs for the meetings that we hold. Not everybody likes to spend as much time in Zoom as I do. So it's better to, sometimes a shorter meeting can be much more productive than a longer meeting, and be respectful of other people's need to control their workday. So as we think ahead, and this is one of the big things I know that a lot of people wanted to get out of today's session, is how do we actually put this stuff into practice? And the answer to that question, to build your Thrive map or your communication plan, is to start with very simple questions, top of mind types of questions. How can you, questions that prepare you to initiate a communication or create a little interaction where you can meet someone else's needs and also have your needs met. So think about the following as you think about how to communicate this week and next week. Who's on your mind today? For me, when I wake up in the morning, there are people on my mind that I know I should talk to for one reason or another. Who's on your mind? What do you appreciate about that person? What do you miss about interacting with that person? When was the last time you checked in? What would you like to tell that person, right? What are their interpersonal needs? Are they more task-based or more social or more relationship-based? And what are your needs? And then when's your next opportunity to talk? And if your next opportunity to talk is, I don't know, then that right there tells you that you should initiate that conversation. Then take it not only at the 30,000 foot view, but then deeper as well. So the first half of this slide challenges us to think about not just the last 2 or 3 months of our working realities, but the last 3 projects that you were on, the last 3 places or units that you worked in, the last 2 or 3 years of your professional career. Who have you interacted with that you really enjoyed that you could put on your sort of map to connect with and touch base with again? What that does is it takes us out of this sort of panic crisis mode, and it puts us into a more of a strategic, agentic mode where we can think more creatively about how we interact with people. The second thing is, of course, does that person want 300 emails from you? No, of course not. Does that person want to be made late for another meeting because you took too much time during your meeting to do some affirmations? Probably not, right? But think about what they might need to see from you and what you might need to have from them and how you can balance those 2 things. The way I do it is as follows. So I think in terms of urgency. Like I said before, I'm a person who's very much in the moment, right? So I think of who is top of mind for me in that particular moment. When we look at Marissa and Amber's maps in just a couple of minutes, you will see that they have a different way of looking at things because they have different professional realities than I do. So my considerations are, what do I need? What do they need? What do I think they need from me? And then what do I most miss or appreciate about them? And then for me as a person, again, who is more on the social end of things, do they need a message from me, or do they need me to actually log into Box and look at the file they just posted? Do they need to see me taking action, leaving those virtual breadcrumbs, and have those be the messages that I'm sending to them? That I'm there, I'm engaged, we don't need to have a meeting, but I'm right there with them in lockstep, and I'm standing right beside them, right? So what are those things you can do to check on a document, to post your comments, those kinds of things that are not necessarily action messages, but carry messages embedded within them. And then other things, as we've seen in some of the Q&A here, what are some of the messages I can send? So I tend to think about it on a daily basis. I make my little list of people I want to get a hold of during that day, and then it kind of rotates from day to day. But let's take a look at how, Marissa, if you don't mind, can you take a look at how you've mapped out your relationships?
We sure can, Mikhail, and admittedly much less inspired than your map. I just started by looking at a day in the life and who I'm in contact with most often during the course of a week. And I think for me, the important thing is start somewhere. It doesn't matter where you start, but start somewhere. So in making this list, I didn't necessarily realize I had to reach out to each of these people, but it did show me where the holes were, where I may not have as much knowledge about someone on a particular team. Maybe we haven't built that relationship and it would be a good thing for me to do. I'll be honest with you, the first thing I did when I sat down to do this was just write a list, and it was people who were I was way overdue in getting in touch with. And it feels so good just to get that down, write that down, and make a commitment to reach out to these people, 1 person a day, 2 people a day. Be mindful about how you manage your time and their time, again, as Mikhail said. So are you gonna have a 30-minute phone call with each of these people? No, but it might be a quick email. Hey, I saw that you won this award, or hey, thanks for publishing that really great piece in the newsletter. I loved reading it. Hope you're well. So for me, it was just starting somewhere.
Thank you very much, Marissa. And you'll see that Marissa's map reflects her leadership position in various different teams. So she has a lot of different stakeholder groups here and a lot of people to connect with on a daily basis. And Amber's map is interesting to me, if we can switch to that one, because hers shows an even different way of looking at a professional network.
So for me, I kind of took a step back from what I typically do on a day-to-day basis, and I looked at a kind of broader view of my professional relationships. I thought about different places I've worked. I did the 3 years back, and actually a whole lot more, but I don't want to age myself too much. But some of these were, in the last century. And that's true. So yeah, I looked at the different types of projects I'd worked on that also were outside my primary focus or primary scope of my role, and where I had had those relationships that were particularly impactful, and thought about why they were and about reaching out to those people to just say, thank you again, or how is that project going? Or I remember you were doing that longitudinal study. It's been a few years. What's that looking like now in terms of the results? So I took kind of that broader view, and I found that I was reaching out to a lot of people that had had a significant impact on my life, and that was rewarding, and also I hope fulfill some needs for them as it did for me.
Thank you so much, Amber. So, you know what, I've got a couple of, we have a couple of great questions at the very, in the Q&A section here. One of the questions from Laurel is how much bridging is appropriate? How do you balance their needs versus your needs? And is this crisis environment too stressful to deal with challenges to a team's dynamic? Three very important questions. If you don't mind, I'll take the first one. Which, how much bridging is appropriate. I think that depends on where you recognize the opportunity. It may be if you are the type of person on your team that tends to be the loudest person in the room or the most proactive person in the room, it may be that you can take a step back and perhaps deputize somebody else to initiate that bridging moment, or have somebody else run a meeting or create the agenda or those kinds of things to create space for them to bridge. But if you see an opportunity that's not getting addressed over the course of several days, I would jump on it and be that bridge between you and that other person. Any advice from either Marissa or Amber on balancing your needs versus their needs, especially in an environment like this where challenges to our team dynamic are multifaceted?
I'll let Marissa respond to
that. Because she already started doing it. Sorry, Amber. Thank you. Yeah, I think the current situation brings with it a lot of there's a lot of again, heaviness to it, and sometimes the best way to engage in that is recognizing that, saying, hey, I know things are super weird right now. I don't know about you. I'm doing this or this, and I just want you to know, I'm sure you're busy, but I just wanted you to know that I was thinking about you, and I can't wait for this to be over so we can continue doing X, Y, or Z. So I think recognizing the fact that we're in a unique time is helpful. And I'm sorry, I'm not sure I'm answering the question because I can't see the question.
Well, how about team dynamic issues? Maybe interpersonal communication issues or team dynamic issues in a virtual environment.
How to deal with them?
Mm-hmm.
I think you'd need to look at whether these are new emerging issues or if these are just iterations or reflections of issues that existed before you went to a virtual environment. And trying to unpack that a little bit. I think the great piece about right now is people are a little bit more willing to be open. They're a little bit more willing to be vulnerable. And so opening those conversations with, hey, I might be imagining this because everything we're doing is different right now, but I just want to make sure that you're okay, or I want to make sure you weren't upset the other day, or I want to make sure that your work team has everything it needs to succeed, and open a conversation and allow other people to, and this is the great thing about people, they tell you what they need, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, but they generally give you a hint once you open the conversation of whether it's something they will or are willing to address at the moment, or something they'd like to table, discuss a little bit later. Amber, thoughts?
I've been through, I'll just add one thing to give Amber a second, unless you have, I know that we've talked about this with different work teams that we've been on, but going around the table and discussing just briefly 1 to 2 minutes per person, what is your favorite thing about this team and what is your least favorite thing about this team? Or what is your favorite thing about the way you work together and what is your least favorite thing about the way you work together? When we have done those little, as we know, forming norming, storming, and performing, those different stages of group development or team development. Every team has to go through a storming session or multiple storming sessions in order to be able to perform at its highest level. So I found a simple question going around making sure everybody has equal time to share uninterrupted, and just say, this is what I really appreciate about the way we work together right now. Here's some things that I don't really like very much. And as Marissa said earlier, the fact that we are in a state of flux right now, I think opens the door to have a conversation like that where nobody feels singled out necessarily.
I'll also add, I mean, you did a wonderful job of sharing what that looks like in practice. And I think with a team with high psychological safety, we certainly can see that working well. Dr. Sandy Pentland, who I talked about earlier with the honest signals, has actually moved some of what he was doing in face-to-face environments to some new research in virtual environments. And they have these amazing graphs that show who's speaking to who and how much time each person spends speaking. And they find that in the virtual environment, the conversations are generally dominated by one person, but that when they have somebody who takes this, who is assigned and takes a conscientious role to manage the conversation and to make sure everyone's heard, that you have a more equitable and egalitarian type of conversation. It takes longer, right? But better decisions come out of it, decisions that have more buy-in. So they see that as a difference of what happens in the virtual environment, because, and a lot of it is this, we don't know when it's okay to start talking, as I'll sometimes actually raise my hand, particularly if you're in any of these Zoom meetings with 10 people or 20 people, or to chat the person who's taken that role privately and say, hey, I have something I want to add. And those might be ways that can help somebody who feels a little less comfortable just jumping in or worrying that they're cutting someone off or interrupting the conversation, to use some of those kind of behind the scenes strategies to get an opportunity to bring a voice into it and help equalize the dynamic.
I know we're over time, but we have one more question. I don't want to leave somebody hanging here. And it's a very good question. Any tips on keeping up with communication once this is all over, right? If one person wants to stay in a remote environment, I think this goes back to what Marissa shared in the very beginning. If one person wants to stay remote while the rest of the team co-locates and goes back to business as usual or almost as usual. Any advice for perhaps, I think I interpreted this as being, how can the person that wants to stay remote communicate that intention to the rest of the team?
So the question is how that person can communicate their desire to continue working remotely, or how they can stay connected after they work remotely, but a lot of other people have remained or come back to the office.
It looks like it's kind of both. How can we sort of broach that topic, but then how can you keep up with communication once you are the remote member on that team?
And she's added, stay connected.
Stay connected.
Stay connected. Well, I know from working with a couple of amazing remote colleagues of our own, Kat and Lauren, are so fantastic about staying present with us, reminding us, hey, we're here, letting us know. And certainly in the earlier days, so they've been working remote for a few years now, but when they first started, we needed to be told, like, hey, I heard this went around, or this email was sent, I need to be on that, or like, don't forget about me, I'm still here. Being visible and present, and sometimes giving a little nudge to, hey, don't forget about me because I'm still thinking about you, is a good way to remind people that their network is more than what they just see in front of them physically. And I'm hoping that will change. I think that dynamic, people are going to be more aware of remote workers after having the experience themselves.
I would absolutely agree with that. It does take reminding for the people who are co-located that you do exist after a little while. But one of the things that you could do, going back to the point I made earlier about establishing a track record of success on a team to build that social context, is just start making notes of things that you were able to accomplish, not just you, but also the rest of your team have been able to accomplish during this whole remote work situation. And maybe solicit some feedback from your supervisors or other members of your team to think, how have things been? Have we been as productive as possible or as normal, or what have been some of the upsides? and then see how you can transfer that to a remote working sort of proposal or remote working environment where you are still the team that gets things done and the person that is a linchpin of helping get that stuff done on your team. And with that, we would like to thank everybody, especially everybody, all the 150 plus people who have stayed with us after the appointed hour. Thank you so much for doing that. If we can go to our final closing slide, we would love to just invite any questions or follow-up from you. Please don't be strangers. Marissa, Amber, and I would love to hear from you. And we're learning as you're learning. We're all learning at the same time. This is the sort of one of those great equalizing moments where everyone's experience matters, everyone's experience is valid, and so we are certainly excited to learn from you as you navigate this remote environment. But thank you all so very much for being here today. We certainly appreciate it, and we look forward to hearing your stories about what has worked for you and helped you thrive in an online environment.
Great, thank you all once again for joining us for the webinar presented with Eller College of Management. We hope you stay safe and see you on future webinars as well. Thank you, everyone.